The Soviet heavy tank IS-2 was used in Guards units. As such, the question arises, was the crew specifically selected, indoctrinated, or in any other way different to regular Soviet tank crews? For this I interview Peter Samsonov, also known as Tank Archives, who looks into Soviet sources of the time. He recently published a book with us about the IS-2, which you can get here or at Amazon. We also look at the ranks of tank commanders, the second in command, and differences to the German tank arm in this video. How was the crew of an IS-2 selected? Did they receive special training or indoctrination, or was this something like with the other tank crews?
So the IS-2 crews were largely composed following the same rules as every other tank crew, but there were two major exceptions. I'm going to start with just describing how the tank crews were formed. So at the beginning of the war, it was a bit of a chaos. Less chaos and more any kind of commander could command a tank. So I've seen even a Yefreitor, which would be a private first class, or a corporal commanding a tank full of other privates. And every so often you see sergeants pop up commanding tanks. By the fall of 1941, that was no longer the case. So there was first a push to standardize the commanders of tank platoons, company commanders at the rank of captain, and battalion commanders at the rank of major, specifically for heavy tanks. The next push came in later in the fall of 1941 when the ranks of the crewmen of the tank were standardized. So a crewman of a heavy tank would be a commander of a heavy tank would be lieutenant or a senior lieutenant. The driver would be starshina, which is a sergeant major. The radio operator would be a senior sergeant. The gunner would also be a starshina. And then the loader, who also in the KV-1 tank, which was the heavy tank at the time, performed the role of the driver's assistant. He was a sergeant. This was more or less a step higher than the equivalent post for medium tanks. So a medium tank, you could have a junior lieutenant command it. Heavy tank, only regular or senior lieutenant. And then, a sergeant instead of a starshina for the driver, etc., etc. This, of course, it says minimum requirement, but this was, in war, you often have to dip below the minimums. So a lot of the time you see sergeants filling in for sergeant major role. I can't recall seeing a junior lieutenant in command of an IS-2 tank, but you do see like privates who are loaders or sergeants who are gunners, as opposed to sergeant loaders and master sergeant or sergeant major gunners. Now we get to the differences. So for the IS-2, the driver was a technician lieutenant, so an officer, as opposed to a senior NCO, as for pre-IS-2 heavy tanks. So what's a technician lieutenant? Well, the Red Army didn't have warrant officer ranks. But from the beginning, you had this kind of two ladders, I suppose. Is on one hand, you had your combat officers, right? So it'd be lieutenant of the tank forces or captain of the tank forces. And on the other hand, you had the technical branch. So before the 1943 rank reforms, you would be a military technician, first class, second class, third class. After the reforms, you'd be a lieutenant technician, is the equivalent of lieutenant. Engineer captain is the equivalent of a captain. Engineer major, equivalent of a major, etc., etc. For some reason, the break between technician and engineer happens not at the break between. So all the NCOs were technicians. Lieutenants were still technicians, and then captain and up were engineers. I don't know why this happens, but the driver was also an officer, equivalent to the commander.
And what was the reason for this?
So the heavy tanks are more complicated to drive than medium tanks and light tanks. This was kind of always acknowledged. And as before, you had the KV tank driver would be a starshina, right? T-34 tank driver would be a sergeant or a senior sergeant. So this was kind of acknowledged. And then as the war went on, the idea that, a heavy tank is actually requires considerably more practice, considerably more training, considerably more technical expertise to not only drive but maintain, like that was, realized, recognized, and rewarded, essentially. So these drivers were, even though the Red Army was started out with this kind of egalitarian, classless organization, the prestige of the officer class came back hard, especially after the 1943 rank reforms. So the drivers enjoyed all the benefits of that, of the IS-2 tanks only.
In that sense, were they also more experienced? Because, I mean, nowadays it's a common joke that basically an officer is generally more of a hazard than an NCO. Like, basically, the running gag is probably like, give an officer a map and you're sure you to get lost or something. So in that sense, had they also more experience, or was this just, so did they came from had they some experience on the medium tanks, or was this just, okay, that guy graduated from officer school or engineering school, but actually was not really more qualified in the, let's say, in the real world?
Yeah, there was. So this is where I've been asked this before, and I think that was my answer in Ask Historians somewhere. What's a junior, like, why does the Soviet army have 3 kinds of lieutenant, right? Junior, regular, and then senior, whereas everyone else is second lieutenant, first lieutenant. Junior lieutenant is a special kind of rank where you take a civilian with some kind of management experience, right? So, for example, if you manage a warehouse as a civilian, you probably know how to manage an army warehouse. And in order to do that, you would need to be an officer, but you don't really have the full scale of experience or expertise that a regular lieutenant would have. So you become, junior lieutenant. You're still an officer, you still have command authority. You don't have command authority over anybody with real military training. And this, this kind of thing still very much applied to the wartime army. You could have some hotshot. I think in the American army, they derisively called them the 90-day wonders or 60-day wonders. I forgot how long military training lasted, but yeah, this was someone with some kind of civilian manager experience, or in this case, civilian technical experience, who would go through fairly short officer courses because, wartime pressures are still mounting. And it's very possible that, that they would see their first tank when they would have no combat experience whatsoever. There were, and of course, a similar thing could happen with regular officers. You would go through accelerated wartime officer training. You would show up in the front lines, and then the NCOs would look at you and say, "This guy's going to kill us all." There is instances that I've read about, not of exactly insubordination, but the more senior NCOs sort of suggest to the officer what his orders should be, and then enthusiastically carry out those orders. But there were, of course, cases where a promising NCO would receive officer training, and there was a pecking order, right? Somebody coming in with prior military experience to go from NCO to officer had prestige over somebody who was just going from civilian life directly to officer. So the second difference. First difference between regular tank crews and IS-2 tank crews was that the drivers were officers, as opposed to seniors and NCOs for medium tanks. The second difference is that they were guards. So IS-2 tanks served in heavy tank battalions. Normally, a tank unit would get a guard status if it excelled in combat, in particularly difficult circumstances, performed particularly well. So, the 1st Guards Tank Brigade got its status for the defense of Moscow in 1941. Obviously, some of the harshest combat on the Eastern Front throughout the entire war. IS-2 tanks, they were formed from the ground up. These units, they were intended to be thrown into the toughest battles, and they were expected to excel. So this guard status was awarded to them ahead of time as, acknowledgement of that. This happened to all. I can't recall exactly when, but after in 1942, this tradition began of forming Guards heavy tank units right from the bat. They used KV-1S tanks at that point. KV-1S and Churchill tanks. Churchill tanks they were the only foreign tanks that had this honor of being used exclusively by Guards units. For some reason, a lot of people write that all Sherman tanks were used by Guards units in the Red Army. I have a video about that. That's very much not the case. The Churchill was the only foreign tank.
Because it was a heavy tank, basically.
Yes, yep. And the organization of these heavy tank regiments, it was, there were only 21 tanks in that regiment. There was a lot of technical support assets, some recon, some close support infantry. Yeah, the idea is that these units would be attached to something else in order to perform some kind of special combat mission.
So similar to the German heavy tank battalions, basically. Although German heavy tank battalion had 45 tanks.
Yeah, you get into this farcical situation where a battalion's larger than a regiment.
Yeah. I mean, I think another unit that always Guards was the Katusha units. I think these were Guards mortar units. But
yes,
it could also be, I think, to a certain degree, because to guard the name for deception a bit. I'm not entirely sure, because they were not mortars, as we know.
Yes, that was the official designation, Guards mortars.
In terms of who was the second command in a Soviet tank?
So the second, this is quite a curious situation, because the second highest ranking member of the crew was the driver. I think in World of Tanks it's the gunner, because they approach it from the idea that dealing damage is the most important part of a tank. Driving around is the most important part of a tank. So the person responsible for the crew's safety after the commander is the driver. In an actual combat situation, the driver focuses on the driving, and ironically, the loader in Soviet, especially in the early war documents, is referred to as a turret commander. So even though he's the lowest ranking crew member in the turret, he commands the turret. In a combat situation, it's not impossible that somebody else in the turret, the gunner or the loader, would take command if the commander was killed. Soviet doctrine definitely encouraged tank crewmen or even infantry personnel to take over when the commander is killed. You had to know your unit's mission, your tank's mission, anyway, even if you're a regular crewman. So this was something that was commended and rewarded. I have a couple of translated award orders where it specifically calls out that Sergeant so-and-so took over command of his tank after the commander was killed, or commanders of a tank taking over the command of the platoon, and so on and so forth.
That's interesting, because for the Germans, the second in command in a tank is the gunner, but the loader is also the lowest in the food chain. So he's also the basic guy now. Back then, nowadays it's a bit different. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching, and see you next time. Bye.